joining me today. Boy, do I have a show for you. I was going to look into where the Manhattan Project scientists all came from, and wow, wow, wow. The Manhattan scientists, what I've been doing is as I run across people, I take a look at where their genealogy was. And gee, the Manhattan scientists, huh? Lots to say about them. And then there's people who claim this whole thing with this nuclear is fake. They point to this famous photograph of Oppenheimer and them loading a wooden box onto a car, and they say, "See, look, it was all staged. Look, they're loaded into a car. Look how could it be dangerous? They're all touching it. They're putting it into a car." Well, then there's another scientist that points out that something was more revealing. I was cruising around the different people on social media claiming that this is not really real, and I ran across a guy and he was talking about sulfur and uranium almost look identical. And there you go. That was a big opening for this show. So I'd already had the genealogy, and then this sulfur and uranium look the same. Boy, what a catch-all point that became. And then, if anybody wants to doubt any of this harm, all of it is true. Everything I'm going to be saying today has been verified over and over by myself. It is, in fact, true. How do I know it's true? Well, because there were some lawsuits by the Navajo Nation, and they sued the government over what happened to them with the uranium mines on native territory. The same Navajo families who helped America win World War II as code talkers, doing one of the most vital jobs in the entire Pacific theater. They later discovered the government allowed them to mine and live around radioactive waste and sulfuric acid uranium processing with almost no protection. They were never warned. They were never told the risks. Many became sick. Many died hideous deaths, and their families spent decades fighting for recognition. That alone tells you this story is real. That alone tells you something went very wrong. When you peel back the layer of these Manhattan projects, it didn't start here in the United States. All of the Manhattan Project people, except for Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was born in the USA, but the rest of them, they all came from Germany, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, and the rest of Central Europe. The equations, the theories, the techniques, and the scientists themselves were pushed out of Europe and into the United States. The USA then supplied the land, the money, the security clearances, and the military command. And Europe actually supplied all of the science, the brains, and the people who actually built the nuclear age. They all came from outside of the United States, except for Oppenheimer, the only USA born scientist of them all. But before I get started today, let's go ahead and lay out some track work here about what is real and what isn't real. What the U.S. actually did to Japan in 1945. There were two completely different weapons used. There were two distinct categories of weapons. There was a fire bombing campaign from March to August of 1945. The weapon that used was napalm-based incendiary bombs. They were called M69 clusters and similar devices. They were delivered using hundreds of B-29 bombers flying at night or low altitude. They targeted Tokyo and more than 60 other cities. Entire neighborhoods were turned into firestorms. Wooden houses burned like kindling. Streets became rivers of flame. Oxygen was sucked out of the air. Many people died by suffocation and burning, a very brutal way to die. What they basically did was there was thermite used on the ground. They brought in those planes, low swooping in. They created this horrific, I'm talking nightmare, wall of fire. These people were trapped and literally burned into the places where they once stood. But the firebombing killed far more Japanese civilians overall than the atomic bombs did. They claimed there were two nuclear bombs on August the 6th and August the 9th of 1945. In Hiroshima, we had the little boy. It was a uranium based fission bomb. It was dropped on August the 6th, 1945. And then in Nagasaki, we had the Fat Man. That was a plutonium based implosion bomb. It dropped on August the 9th, 1949. Each bomb was dropped by a single B 29, not by large fleets of planes. It was announced and described as atomic or nuclear weapons. It was presented as unprecedented and decisive. But the U.S. government never said Tokyo was destroyed by nuclear weapons. It never said Osaka, Kobe, Toyama, and other firebomb cities were destroyed by atomic bombs. These cities were always described as incendiary raids, firebomb attacks, or conventional bombing with incendiaries. So historically, firebombing means napalm and incendiary clusters. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're talking about small number of nuclear bombs. So why people confuse firebombing with nuclear bombing? Well, because they pretty much have just kind of confused all of the words all the way around. For example, in Tokyo, March the 9th through the 10th, 1945 was a big firebombing. Roughly 100,000 people were killed in a single night. Fire tornadoes formed. They melted metal and boiled water in canals. About 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. Civilians died in their homes, in shelters, or while trying to flee through burning streets. And then we had Hiroshima, August the 6th, 1945, also claimed to be an atomic bomb. About 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly. About 140,000 were dead by the end of 1945, and that covered roughly 4.7 square miles were destroyed. Additional deaths did continue over time from radiation sickness and injuries. But from a civilian standpoint, both events turned large areas into charred remains. Buildings were collapsed, burned bodies and rubble. Even though the physical mechanisms were different, firebombing is napalm and incendiary fires. Nuclear is blast, heat, and radiation. The scale of destruction and the images of burned cities make it emotionally easy to mix them up, especially decades later. So the U.S. really didn't lie when they said that the napalm raids were nuclear. They didn't say that. But it did instead downplay the scale and horror of the napalm raids, highlighted and dramatized the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The firebombings killed more civilians than the so called atomic bombs. The doctrine behind firebombing was burn entire civilian cities to break morale. After August 1945, it was far more convenient to just say, well, the atomic bomb ended the war. Well, this one technique kept changed everything. So in reality, most physical destruction in Japan came from napalm. In memory and propaganda, nuclear weapons became the central story. So, why did the atomic story overshadow the napalm story? Well, possibly these reasons. The historical technology, firebombing and burning cities had been done before, Dresden, Hamburg, etc. Napalm was new chemistry, but the method, mass incendiary bombings, was familiar. Nuclear weapons, however, could be marketed as a new era, the future of war, the ultimate weapon, and the press and politicians loved that idea. U.S. leaders wanted other nations, especially the Soviet Union, to see that we have something absolutely decisive and untouchable. By emphasizing the atomic bomb, it strengthened U.S. bargaining power, justified a permanent nuclear weapons program. But napalm is a moral disaster. Napalm burns people literally alive. It sticks to the skin, clothing, and the ground. The civilian imagery from Vietnam later made napalm globally infamous. So even in World War II, the idea of deliberately burning entire cities filled with civilians was disturbing. It was easier long term to talk about one magic weapon that ended the war than to revisit the grim core of firebombing. So the U.S. did not pretend napalm raids were nuclear, so let's keep that straight. Instead, it let the atomic narrative dominate memory because napalm was too horrific and too obviously aimed at civilians. So take a look at what happened after these attacks, the cancer for Hiroshima and nuclear. People compare Hiroshima to the wrong examples. When people think nuclear health effects, they compare Hiroshima and Nagasaki to Chernobyl, Fukushima, and the Nevada test site fallout, and also to uranium miners and mill workers. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not like Chernobyl. It was one large acute dose of radiation at the time of detonation. No reactor cores were sitting there melting for weeks. The fires burned out. Rebuilding became relatively quickly. Environmental contamination was serious, but not ongoing like a meltdown. And I don't totally believe this whole part, but I will keep reading here. Because we had Chernobyl, we had Nevada, we had the Bikini Atoll, and we had Hanford. That involved long-term release of radioactive material, and that involved fallout over large areas. And also, there were isotopes. There was water, soil, crops, animals, and human bodies. And people had chronic exposure over decades or years. Because the explosion patterns were different, the cancer patterns were different. And I do agree on that point. So, what this means for cancer rates in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cancer rates did increase among survivors. There were significant health effects, but it did not look like a permanent wasteland of mutant forests, everyone dropping dead within a generation. Instead, radiation sickness killed many in the days and weeks after the blast. Long term cancer risks went up, but not to mass extinction levels. The cities were rebuilt. People moved back and lived there. This looks wrong to people who were taught a Hollywood version of nuclear disaster. So, does that make the story fake? Not necessarily. Because Hollywood and the Cold War propaganda, they sold images of glowing landscapes, mutant children, permanent voids where citizens and cities once stood. Those images fit with reactor meltdowns and long-term fallout more than they fit a single-use city busting weapon in 1945. So, why did people become skeptical? Well, firebombing killed more people in some cases than the bombs. The ruins look similar, whether caused by firebombs or nuclear blast. Many survivors lived long lives, contrary to everyone dies young images. No visible mutant apocalypse in Hiroshima today. The nuclear story was politically useful for the U.S. during the Cold War. Japan's government cooperated with post war censorship and narrative control for years. So, how much of this is true? I don't really know. I'm not going to die on this particular hill. I think there was some radiation used within those bombs they dropped on Japan, but not probably likely to the level of radiation that everybody is thinking. So whatever happened to napalm? Well, that's an interesting story. After World War, excuse me, after the Vietnam War, napalm got a new name. It became MK-77. You start to notice all these MK deals here. I still think that MK means Mein Kampf. Just my guess. So after Vietnam, the official weapons stopped, but actually continued. The word napalm became politically toxic, global outrage, iconic photographs of burned civilians, protests, and international criticism, UN protocols restricting incendiary near civilian populations. But leave it to the U.S. The USA did not stop using napalm type weapons. Did you hear me very clearly? Even after Vietnam, the U.S. did not stop using napalm type weapons. It just stopped using the word napalm. Instead, it shifted to MK-77, a thickening fuel gel incendiary bomb, is what they're calling it now. So functionally, MK-77 still sticks to surfaces, still burns extremely hot, and still ignites large areas. So they just replace napalm with a different recipe and a new name. But napalm has been used after Vietnam. It was used in the Gulf War in 1991, Kosovo 1999, Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003. What are the steps they use? Well, they deny it is napalm. Then step two, they will admit it's MK-77. And then they'll say, well, it's technically not napalm. Well, I got news for you. It's the same. Why the name change was so important, because napalm came to mean war crimes, burned children, uncontrolled civilian suffering. So changing the formulation and the label to MK-77 allowed technical denials, public relations distance, and they could then say, "Oh, we don't use napalm anymore." This is classic rebranding. So it did not stop using napalm incendiary gel weapons. It just changed the name because this fits a wider pattern. Torture, enhanced interrogations, mercenaries became contractors, assassinations became targeted killings, and napalm became MK-77. Of course, we have Korea War. My father flew in the Korean War. He was a navigator during Korean War. My father also died of a lung cancer. He was diagnosed at a military base. I am 100%. Those doctors lied to me. They lied to my face about how my father got cancer. He likely got cancer wearing that mask he had to wear while firebombing other innocent people. So, in Korea, the forgotten firebombing war. People often jump from World War II to Vietnam and they skip Korea, but let's not skip reality here. U.S. bombing destroyed a higher percentage of many Korean cities than in Japan. Some cities in Korea were 40 to 95% destroyed. Napalm was used heavily and extensively. B-29 bombers again played a central role. And if you're ever thinking, well, it must be really hard to research this stuff, no, actually, it's quite simple. Just hold your head on straight. Don't fall for lies and just take a look. I uncovered this whole thing because of the B-29. I was looking around and I was wondering what kind of planes they were flying during the Japanese during World War II. And I found they were flying the B-29. Well, then I did a search for the B-29, and lo and behold, the B-29 was also used to firebomb Wuhan, China before Japan got bombed. So it's not complicated. You just need to focus and use your common sense. So, yeah, the B-29 became a real big deal also in Korea. But if you read history, they'll say, well, the B 29 first flew during Japan. Well, technically, no, it didn't. It first flew into Wuhan, China, and firebombed the heck out of that country first with approval of the Chinese because the U.S. was bombing China from a Chinese base. So somehow, I don't know how it all worked out. I wasn't there. But somehow the U.S. was given permission by the Chinese to bomb Wuhan, China before Japan. And I figured all of that out just by looking for, hey, what's with this B 29? So dig in there. You can do this. Keep looking for yourselves. So Korea was a second firebombing war and it destroyed cities. It broke morale and it forced a surrender. Yet it barely appears in public memory compared to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was much, much worse. So, who else got sick in these nuclear programs? Well, they had this thing called the Demon Core, like demon, DEMON. The Demon Core was a 6.2 kilogram plutonium sphere used for critical experiments. The first one had an accident. A man named Harry Daghlian, August 21st, 1945. He accidentally dropped a tungsten carbide brick onto the core. The result, a prompt critical reaction. He took an estimated dose about 5,100 rems, far above lethal. He got acute radiation sickness. He got burns, organ failure, neurological decline, and he died after 25 days at age 24. The second accident was with Louis Slotin, May 21st, 1946. They unfortunately dropped a screwdriver, slipped while manually performing a risky experiment. The core went briefly supercritical, so he took a dose of 2,100 rems. He was vomiting within minutes. Skin was sloughing off. White blood cell collapse. Death after 9 days at age 35. So these two cases alone destroy the myth that no one at the center died from radiation. Others exposed to weapons and production sites at locations such as Los Alamos, Hanford, Oak Ridge, Chicago Pile, uranium mills, and processing facilities. At those places, there were critical incidents, contamination of workers, spills and leaks, inhalation of plutonium and uranium dust, long term exposure to mixing fission products, excuse me. So the consequences, they had radiation sickness in some cases. They increased cancers and leukemias. They had long-term health complications and they had early deaths. Many of these cases stayed buried or classified reports or internal health records for decades. So people will say, well, all of the people at the Manhattan Project, they all lived to old age. Well, that is really misleading. The argument usually lists famous names like Oppenheimer, Feynman, Teller, Both, Olam, Wigner, Cesar, von Neumann. Most of these men were theorists, designers, or senior managers, not hands on radiation workers. They worked in offices and meeting rooms, not in plutonium glove boxes. They did calculations, planning, and oversight. They were exposed to stress, not to plutonium powder. The people who did the dangerous physical work were the machinists, the chemical technicians, the radiologist, the reactor operators, the uranium mill workers, and the downwind communities. They all inhaled contaminated dust. They handled highly radioactive materials. They stood near unshielded equipment in the early days. They drank or bathed in contaminated water. They later developed cancers and other illnesses. So, using the long lives of famous theorists as proof is a classic case of selecting the least exposed group and ignoring the people who actually paid the price. And this is really key. For example, out at Rocky Flats, I have a relative who had worked at Rocky Flats. That same relative ended up with lung cancer. Well, can I connect all the dots? Well, of course I can't. But it seems mighty suspicious to me, right? That person worked as a machinist out at Rocky Flats when they're first doing the plutonium testing. So, yes, you can't just throw this all out. I think there's been a lot of splicing and dicing of words and stuff. But yes, radiation is in fact true. But I think the problem is this: we're looking at radiation, and we also should be looking at sulfur because there's two types of radiation exposure. One is acute, high dose external exposure, and that duration can be seconds to minutes. And that happened with those demon core accidents. And that effect was severe, immediate damage, and often fatal. And then there's also type 2, the chronic low dose external exposure. They can have exposure for months to years. Some workers near reactors or waste, and they have elevated long term cancer risk. And then you have this group 3, internal contaminants, the most dangerous over time. They're actually inhaling the radioactive dust. They're drinking contaminated milk or water, and they're eating contaminated plants or animal. And this group would be the downwinders, the people near these test sites, the Marshall Island people, and some uranium and plutonium workers. Once the isotopes enter the body, they may lodge in the bone. They may concentrate in the thyroid. They embed in the lungs. These exposures continue from the inside quietly for years. If radiation were harmless, there would be no downwinder clusters. There would be no uranium minor compensation being paid. There would be no nuclear worker illness funds. There would be no Marshall Islands health programs. But the U.S. created programs such as the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act or the Energy Workers Act. Billions of dollars have been paid out acknowledging harm. So, yes, many Manhattan Project theorists or managers lived long lives, but that does not mean nuclear work was ever safe. The workers and the downwinders suffered and died from radiation. And the demon core and other accidents prove lethal radiation is real. But the no one got hurt narrative is false, and it also erases the real victims. It acts like saying, yeah, your family didn't really die a horrific die because we all think this is fake. This is absolutely not true and never was true. That is how they're trying to reposition it right now. Oppenheimer was the face of the Manhattan Project. He appeared in carefully staged photos and films. He was shown examining equipment or materials, but he did not routinely handle fissile cores. He did not do the most dangerous physical experiments. He was not the one machining uranium or breathing inside the hottest zones. That was done by the technicians, the machinists, the chemical workers, and the ordnance crews, and they rarely appear in the famous photos. And then there's this other thing. They had a nuclear test town. They built this test. The U.S. built fake suburbs, complete with streets, houses, mannequins, food and refrigerators, cars and power lines. And they built these towns near the Nevada test site and other ranges. I think those tests were completely 100% fake. Go look at the test yourself. There's something funny about how the camera worked. That was all created. Absolutely was all staged for effect. And then we also have the nuclear tests. They produce real nuclear yields, but it was all manipulated. The safety claims, the distance guidelines, the fallout maps, the warnings to civilians, the health data and public reports, that was all manipulated. The towns, the mannequins, and narration were partly theater. So then we have the testing out at the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. I've done shows about all of this stuff. The timeline of testing, and here's the arrogance of that whole thing. Bikini Atoll was not the name of that group of islands. They changed the name because of their own frigging arrogance. They changed it to Bikini. That's where the name Bikini came from. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. detonated 23 nuclear bombs at Bikini Atoll alone. Across the Marshall Islands, a total of 67 nuclear tests were conducted. So I've got all of the tests down below, including Castle Bravo. They really bombed the heck out of that place. Castle Bravo in 1954, it was 15 megatons. It was 1,000 times bigger than Hiroshima. So cancer and thyroid problems are so high there now. Yeah, because the soil, the lagoon water, the coconut trees, everything has been contaminated. So yeah, so there's high levels of thyroid cancer there. There's leukemia and other cancers, thyroid failure. There's a lot going on over there. The island has been abandoned, but now they're doing tours. See, here's what happens. Once they think they can get some more money out of people, they'll then start doing tours and other kind of dangerous activities. And that is the whole trick with this entire thing. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't touch it until it got you. And then you got cancer, and then you're going to be dead, dead, dead. So yeah. So anyway, so um those if that wasn't real, those islanders, that was just a discuss I don't want to go into it all, but that was a disgusting thing. They lied to those islanders. They pulled up in a big naval boat. Yeah, it was that listen to my show about that Bikini and Marshall Islands. It took me a long time to figure out all the people from Marshall Islands ended up in a lot of them ended up in Arkansas. I couldn't figure out for years how they ended up in Arkansas. Well, how they ended up in Arkansas was this. I guess there was I think it was a Tyson's poultry plant in Hawaii, and Hawaii was pretty close to where all the Marshall Islands was taking place. So I guess a lot of the people from the Marshall Islands moved to Hawaii, and then because this Tyson packing deal, then they ended up at Arkansas. Yeah, so that's why a lot of people from Marshall Island ended up in all places but Arkansas. But anyways, I love weird details. But anyways, let me continue on here. So then we have sulfur, nuclear, and the danger of saying nothing happened because w- not only looking alike, sulfur and uranium look exactly alike. They are yellow, cakish looking things. They both look alike, okay? And 100% they've been using both because all of this came out of those Navajo lawsuits, okay? So here's what they're really cooking up. Both sulfur based and nuclear related exposures can burn skin and lungs, can damage organs, can lead to cancers, can overlap in the same mines, plants, and war zones. And in uranium mining and processing, this is where it gets interesting. Sulfuric acid is commonly used to extract uranium from ore. So now we've got sulfuric acid in the picture with uranium. And then the workers will encounter fumes, aerosols, acid mists, and uranium dust and radon. The word radon, pay attention to that for a second here. So this creates a double hazard. You get chemical harm from the acid and the sulfur compounds, and you also will get the radiological harm from uranium and its decay products. So this overlap with the sulfur and the uranium blurs causal lines, and that lets them be able to say harm is uncertain. It was able to then attribute illness to lifestyle or smoking and avoid acknowledging specific responsibilities. So, if this were true, if nuclear work was harmless and bomb tests were safe and napalm was not really used, no one got sick. Then we would not have had the demon core deaths. We would not have had compensation laws for nuclear workers and downwinders. We would not have had cancer clusters in the Marshalls and around test sites. We would not have had sick uranium miners and Navajo families. We would not have had thyroid damage epidemics and exposed children, and billions of dollars in settlements and medical monitoring were all paid out. So the actual truth is nuclear weapons and nuclear production is real. Napalm and its descendants, MK-77, are in fact real. The public stories were heavily sanitized. Real people suffered and died, often the ones with the least visibility and power. The manipulation sits in what was emphasized, what was renamed, what was hidden, who was remembered, and who was erased. Before you get lost in arguments about fake versus real or sulfur versus nuclear, there is a basic layer of facts that no honest person can erase. These things have been documented, the sulfur and the nuclear, in declassified government files. They have appeared in court cases and compensation programs. They have appeared in medical and epidemiological studies. They have appeared in environmental measures and in survivor testimonies backed by physical evidence. People died from acute radiation exposure in labs. The demon core at Los Alamos are the clearest examples. Their deaths are not speculative. Downwinders, families living downwind of test sites in Nevada, Utah, and around Hanford in Washington, showed higher rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, bone cancer, and other illnesses. These patterns match fallout paths and match isotopes released by test and production facilities. The U.S. government ultimately excuse me, the U.S. government ultimately created the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which would not exist if nothing had happened. People in the Marshall Islands, especially after Castle Bravo, were dusted with visible fallout. Radioactive isotopes were measured in their bodies, food, and environment. Even today, certain atolls remain dangerously contaminated. Uranium miners and mill workers develop predictable illnesses. Miners on the Navajo Nation and other uranium regions develop lung cancers, kidney disease, and other diseases at rates far beyond background. Mill workers handling tailings and yellowcake developed linked conditions. These illnesses were associated with uranium dust, radon daughters, and toxic processing chemicals. Fallout from atmospheric testing still shows up in soils, sediments, home bones, and even stored foods from the mid 20th century. Governments lied about safety, doses, and risk. They told soldiers, residents, and workers that fallout was safe, that doses were low, that conditions were controlled. Internal documents later showed they knew far more about risks than they admitted publicly. Public relations imagery around nuclear tests was carefully staged. There were model towns, mannequins, and orchestrated camera angles were used on test films. Much of what the public saw was theater, layered over real explosions and real fallout. That means anyone insisting nothing happened is not debating theory anymore. They're denying the documented suffering of real people. The real reasonable position is something happened and the story is rigged. Nuclear weapons and radiation exist. Sulfur and chemical damage exist. People were seriously harmed. Governments and industries then built narratives to cover, distort, or redirect those harms. This is fundamentally different from two extreme positions. It was all safe and justified, or it was all fake and staged. The reasonable stance is this: the technologies are real, the harms are real, and the storytelling around them is manipulated to protect the power. The position I'm taking takes survivors seriously, respects the physical evidence, acknowledges the existence of nuclear physics, allows for sulfur, chemical, and industrial exposure to be major players. It also treats official messaging as suspect, not physics itself as pretend. It mirrors other areas where COVID was real, but its management and messaging were politicized. Wars happened, but their causes and casualties were spun and edited. Environmental disasters occurred, but industries lobbied and lied about them. So when someone says nukes never existed or radiation never harms anyone, they are not being critical. They are erasing proof. The harm is real, and the official story about that harm is incomplete or very dishonest at best. And also, the why the all fake arguments turn into attacks on the survivors. Once a person insists that nuclear tests never happened, or fallout and radiation never harmed anyone, or all cancer clusters are made up, they are forced into certain behaviors. They must say survivors are lying, mistaken, or brainwashed. Cancer clusters become coincidence. Illness becomes mass hysteria. People's lived suffering becomes something to mock or dismiss. They ignore physical evidence, isotope measurements in bone or soil, actual contamination maps. They avoid compensation programs that acknowledge fault. They treat declassified documentation as irrelevant. They must say, in essence, well, all the documents are fake. All officials were acting in layered psyops forever. And then they end up denying physics altogether. They have to argue that ionizing radiation does nothing despite medical use, lab studies, and known accidents. So, what they do is they erase what actually happened. But these are all invisible dangers and why they're so useful to power. Modern industry and military hazards often have one thing in common: you cannot see them directly. You cannot see ionized radiation or sulfur dioxide gas or asbestos fibers or microscopic uranium dust or dioxins and PCBs in the air or low level nerve agents or microplastic particles. This is very different from fire, blood, or chaparral or broken bones. Our nervous system evolved to respond to the visible, obvious threat. Invisible hazards slip under that radar. When a hazard has no color, no consistent smell, no immediate dramatic symptom, officials can then say, "Oh, if it were harmful, you would feel something right away." Or, "Hey, you look fine. Therefore, nothing is wrong." Or, "Hey, any illness years later could be from absolutely anything." And that leaves citizens no way to prove otherwise. Delay equals deniability. Cancers and chronic illnesses from radiation, chemicals, or dust usually take years to develop. They arrive in the form of ordinary diseases. They need long term statistical analysis to connect to exposure. By the time the patterns emerge, the projects have ended, companies have closed, records are missing or scattered, key decision makers are dead or retired. This is why that pattern appears again and again: the lead in gasoline, tobacco, asbestos, Agent Orange, Teflon, fallout, and uranium. The harm is slow, therefore, it is easy to deny. So let's take a look at this sulfur, uranium, and radon and mustard gas. What a ball of wax this stuff is. So let's start off with sulfur. The bright yellow element. Sulfur, in its pure form, it is a bright yellow solid. But sulfur, unlike uranium, is not radioactive. It is found naturally near volcanoes and in many rock formations. It is used in many industrial processes, especially as sulfuric acid. People often think sulfur equals a poisonous smell, but pure sulfur does not smell. The rotten egg smell comes from hydrogen sulfur and other sulfur compounds. Then we have uranium, the heavy radioactive metal. Uranium is a dense metal often found in ores with yellow or green coatings. Uranium is, in fact, radioactive. It is the backbone of nuclear fuel in many early nuclear weapons. Certain uranium minerals are yellowish, so in mines and tailings, both yellow sulfur and yellow uranium ore can appear to the untrained eye. They look like yellow crusts, powder, or layers in rock, or both may be called yellow stuff by workers. Then you add processed uranium or yellow cake, which is also literally a yellow powder, and confusion grows from there. So, how are they using sulfur in uranium mines? Well, uranium extraction and milling commonly use sulfuric acid for leaching, sulfur burning plants to create that acid. Tanks and pipelines carry sulfuric solutions. So, on a uranium site, you might see piles of yellow sulfur, tanks labeled for acids, yellowish ore, dust and stains in shades of yellow and brown. Experienced workers know the difference, but the presence of both materials side by side encouraged confusion in early years, made it easy for outsiders to misinterpret what they see. And then we have the word radon, Radon, and pay very close attention to radon. Radon is an invisible gas. Is perfect for a word game. Radon is radioactive. It's odorless. It's colorless. It's produced naturally when uranium decays. Radon collects in mines, in poorly ventilated basements, in underground workings. Radon itself does not smell like sulfur, yet people often experience sulfurous smells from other gases, symptoms in the same confined spaces where radon is present. So, in the public mind, these get blurred. Gas that makes you sick, radioactivity, bad air in mines. And then we have mustard gas. Mustard gas is actually made with sulfur. It is an oily, blistery agent. It smells like garlic, onions, or mustard. It damages the skin, the lungs, and the DNA. It is not something that appears in nature by accident. It was created deliberately and weaponized. So, why do people lump these together? Well, because of stories. The sulfur and mustard gas in World War I. We had uranium and radon in the nuclear age. Then there was sulfuric acid in uranium processing. And then there were yellowish colors in ore, chemicals, and waste. So, in people's minds, yellow, sulfur, uranium, gas, nuclear, and poison all become one blended image. But scientifically, sulfur, uranium, radon, and mustard gas are all distinct. But their overlap is historic and visual, not chemical identity. So, where did the word radon even come from? It's been used as a cover word, and it hid both sulfur and nuclear. So, radon was used not just as a scientific term, but as a shield or a cover story. So, why radon was such an effective label? Well, first of all, it sounds kind of like radiation, right? So, radon has several properties that make it perfect for misdirection. Radon is really real, it's invisible. The public does not understand it. In health effects, it requires long term study. So, when miners or residents got sick, government officials could say, we need to study radon more. And they could also say the relationship between radon and illness is not fully clear. Or, well, it might be radon, or it might be something else. This deflects attention away from clear, concrete radiation exposure from uranium and its decay products. It deflects attention from clear, concrete chemical burns from sulfuric acid and other toxins. So, how radon absorbed all the blame and therefore none of it? Radon became a kind of sync word. Lung cancer? Well, it could be radon. Respiratory problems? Well, it could be radon. General mind sickness? Well, it could be radon. By making radon the mystery gas, authorities avoided saying uranium dust and radon daughters are blasting your lungs with alpha particles, or sulfuric acid mist is burning your airways. Radon sat in the middle, everything and nothing all at the same time. So when agencies spoke of gaseous exposures instead of radiation exposure, they emphasized radon protege instead of uranium decay products coating lung tissue. They could then point to poor mind conditions and smoking instead of radiation and acid mist. So that really blurred the causation, making everything sound like natural background risk, preserving the idea that only extreme accidents like a meltdown could really hurt people. And it really worked with the downwinders. The downwinders inhaled fallout particles. They inhaled iodine 131, cesium 137, strontium 90, plutonium, and other isotopes. Soil and dust lofted into the air by blasts. But labeling their problem as radon, or implying that, did three things. It made the hazard sound like something that just happens in nature. They avoided saying tests contaminated your food and water with fission products, or they didn't have to say they created space for endless arguments about cause. So radon did not just function as a scientific term, it functioned as a curtain over the whole thing. And here's another reason that I think that what we're feeling is also sulfur. My teeth. I have been in an environment, and I've talked about this in the past. When people go into an event like Chernobyl or what, they end up with what has been identified as an electrical burn, either on their face or their hands. Well, I've had a burn mark on my face for almost since 2020 when I took my first big exposure, and it has now expanded to the point that it is, well, it is extraordinarily painful. And it also has affected my teeth because I'm 100% sure that the burn mark on my face now is from sulfur. Okay. It's not from radiation. And I'm 100% my teeth are getting all weird. And like I said, the added benefit of being sick like this is you also look crazy, right? I got a big burn mark on my face, losing my hair. My teeth are now pointed. Yeah, some of my teeth, they have etchings, like mineral etchings in them. And some of my teeth are actually pointed. I will, in fact, take a picture of my teeth and add it to my page over my website. But my teeth and the burn mark on my face 100% lead me to conclude that's what inside of my house, what's going on is sulfur and likely uranium. But I think the primary thing might be sulfur, but let's keep exploring here. So, um, My teeth are changing shape. I have a large spot on my face, and okay, let me see here. Oh yeah. So what they'll do is they'll tell you to go buy a radon meter, right? Well, that's a crazy idea, right? So they'll tell you, well, the radon meter didn't show any radon in your house, so you must be crazy is how this ends up, right? Um so what happens is that if you end up with meters that show normal, yet real harm from substances that they don't track, well, you'll get labeled as crazy, right? If you try to seek a doctor's help. The only solution to any of this, and I will say this for the 1 millionth time, get fresh air coming into your house. Do not buy any of those air fresheners for inside of your house. You need actual fresh air pumped into your house. That is the only thing to stop from ending up like I've ended up. So I need to, let me see here. Anyway, I got to finish up this radon stuff next. Let me see here. Yeah, I'm gonna put this on hold right now. I need to take a break so I can really get back into this radon stuff and what's going on here in my house because I believe 99.999%, and I'm willing to die on this hill. I believe that people with all this anxiety, this depression, all of these mental illnesses, all of these long term internal issues, I believe it's all coming from either the sulfur or the radiation. So let me put this on hold for now. Okay, let me keep going here. Nothing like an actual crazy person trying to tell you what crazy people look like now, right? This really has, well, it has impacted my mind, but not in ways that I'm losing track of things. So, but anyway, so let's say, where was I here? So anyway, you try to go to a doctor, and well, doctors are not really set up to notice any of this stuff, and they're really not going to sign any document saying, well, this disease is caused by pollution or radiation. So when symptoms are unusual, multi-system, or chronic, and not easily matched to one diagnosis, and you'll find out a little bit more later here, they have buried this sulfur thing so deeply that even if your doctor was the swiftest person on the planet and he picked up on the uranium part, I can guarantee you he won't pick up on the sulfur part. And sulfur actually matches to a large degree what the nuclear stuff does. So then the people get labeled as anxiety, depressed. They have sleep disorders, personality disorders, just out of not feeling well, right? So, because how you get misread as crazy as this, you get a cognitive fog, you get irritable, you get memory problems, sensory overload, pain that moves or fluctuates, visible skin or tooth damage. Because these symptoms cross multiple domains, they get misread as psychiatric or attention seeking. And the more you try to explain the complex pattern of exposure, the more delusional it can sound to someone who is not trained in environmental health. So, what happens with the teeth? Now, the reason I'm thinking, well, it's actually what's coming into my home is actually both, okay? Both, okay? And both of those things are being used to create the dirty electricity. But the teeth, okay? Airborne acids and the sulfuric acid, right, can soften and etch enamel. And I will take a photo of my teeth and I will post on my website later this week. But yeah, my teeth are definitely crazy looking. A couple of them are pointed and they have etches. And the dust can sandblast surfaces. Yeah, my teeth are definitely sandblasted. And uneven exposure can cause one side of the mouth to be worse than the other. Yes, my left side, really horrible looking. And then with the skin, you get chronic low level contact with irritants can cause persistent spots, scars, or discolorization. Irritation areas may never fully heal if exposure continues, and that is key. I have had the same mark on my face. It has started to get much worse in the last few months, but it has been there consistently, and it is wickedly painful. So, um, so what I'm suggesting is you got to do what you want to do. But if you start to feel sick from some of these things, I don't think you're going to find relief at the doctor's office. You're going to find relief if you open those windows, get yourself some good THC, and buckle in and try to survive the rest of this game board. So, nuclear harm, why no one gets sick or collapses. So whenever we've already talked a lot about this, they talk a lot about, well, these people didn't get sick because it takes for so long. So let's talk about sulfur versus radiation and how their damages overlap and how that help the cover up. So let's get started here. In uranium mining and milling, people were rarely exposed to just one thing. They were exposed to radiation from uranium and its decay products. They were exposed to radon gas and radon daughters, sulfuric acid mist, sulfur dioxide and other fumes, heavy metals like lead and arsenic, silica and dust. That mixed exposure makes illnesses messy, creates overlapping symptom sets, makes it harder to prove this disease is X and not Y, which is perfect for all these cases, right? Because that way they can kill you ruthlessly and no one can ever really put a pen on it, right? Because radiation damages our DNA, and that's the one thing they want to destroy is our DNA. Radiation also kills fast dividing cells. It causes cancer and blood disorders. And sulfur and the acids, they burn the tissues. They cause chronic inflammation. They also contribute to cancers over time. So the body of a miner or a downwinder may years later, they might show radiogenic looking cancers. They might also have chemical burns and scarring. This gave officials room to argue forever about which factor mattered more. They used this overlap deliberately, in my opinion. They hid behind complexity to avoid accountability, but really, this is not that complicated. So, anyway, what was fake was actually the reassurance, the framing, the omissions, the language games like radon and safe levels and minimum risk, the heroic clean images versus the dark hidden sick bodies. So nothing happened is the biggest lie. Something happened over and over again. The work now is not to prove that danger exists. The work is to show how the narrative was built to hide who actually paid the price. And here's how sulfuric acid turned the lung into a radiation sponge. And this part gets really insane, okay? Sulfuric acid destroys the lung barrier, so radiation can go deeper. So, by using sulfuric acid in these mines, it actually turbocharged the radiation. And that is the part that is really, truly, well, it's all evil, but that becomes really, it becomes more evil. Or how you classify that, I don't know. But so sulfuric acid destroys the lung barrier so radiation can go deeper. The lungs are supposed to work like a shield. A thin membrane plus a mucus layer keeps most particles from ever reaching the bloodstream. However, sulfuric acid, as a mist, a vapor, or fine aerosol, tears that system apart. It strips the irritant airway lining. It causes micro burns along the respiratory tract. It destroys the protective mucus layer. It opens up microscopic holes in the barriers. Once this barrier is damaged, radioactive particles can lodge deeper into the lung tissue. And then those radon daughters, the polonium and all that, they stick directly to raw, injured surfaces instead of being caught in mucus and coughed out. So the result, the internal radiation dose skyrockets, even if the measured air level looks moderate. Sulfuric acid dissolves uranium dust and makes it more absorbable. Normally, much of the uranium dust inhaled is relatively insoluble. If the body's defenses are intact, a lot of it stays in the mucus, gets cleared out by the cilia, is eventually coughed out or swallowed and excreted. But sulfuric acid changes that. It partially dissolves uranium oxides, converts them into more soluble uranium sulfates, increases the chemical mobility of uranium in body fluids. So instead of sitting on the surface, more uranium gets into the bloodstream. Radiation dose rises not because the uranium gets stronger, but because much more of it penetrates and embeds in tissues. Now, really, how diabolical is this stuff, right? And the acid mist makes those radon daughters cling harder and travel farther. Radon by itself is a gas. Its daughters are tiny radioactive metals that like to stick to dust particles, water droplets, and mucus. When you add sulfuric acid mist, you create aerosol droplets that carry these radioactive metals, particles that can bypass upper defenses and reach deep into bronchial holes, droplets that cling to already damaged tissue and stay there longer. This is why miners showed huge lung cancer rates even when the radon readings on paper were moderate. The acid mist made every bit of radiation more effective and more deeply deposited than the official numbers implied. Acid driven inflammation multiplies radiation's generic damage. Inflamed tissue is full of immune cells, rapidly regenerating, flooded with reactive chemicals and stress signals. Radiation, meanwhile, shatters the DNA, breaks chromosomes, kills or mutates cells. Sounds like some great stuff, doesn't it? When radiation hits already inflamed, fast dividing tissue, the mutation probably jumps dramatically. Damaged cells are more likely to survive in a corrupted state. Public health called this co-carcinogenic effect. Two hazards that may each be damaging on their own, but multiply each other when combined. Sulfuric acid paralyzes the lungs' cleaning system. The lungs rely on tiny beating hairs, cilia, to move mucus and contaminants upward. Sulfuric acid exposure paralyzes or kills those cilia, strips away or thickens the mucus, slows clearance of dust and particles, and as a great result, radioactive particles stay lodged in lung tissues for years. Each embedded particle keeps delivering the dose every single day. The longer particles remain, the higher the dose and the higher the cancer risk. Scarring, acid scarring traps radioactive particles permanently. Chronic acid exposure leads to fibrosis, scar tissue, thickened, stiff lung regions. Scar tissue does not clear particles well, has distorted airways and blind pockets. So radioactive particles end up trapped inside scar pockets, embedded in fibrotic tissue, locked in place, continuously emitting alpha radiation for years. Boy, sign me up. Even small amounts of contamination become lethal over time when they cannot be removed. Acid weakens local immunity. Boy, this is just really a hit maker, isn't it? So the acid weakens local immunity, making radiation damage harder to repair. Boy, this thing is really something else. Radiation damage can sometimes be repaired by the body's DNA repair machinery and immune system, but sulfuric acid exposure creates chronic irritation, weakens local immune defenses, impairs microphages, the cleaning cells that remove debris and abnormal cells. So when radiation damage occurs in this environment, fewer cells are repaired correctly. More mutated cells escape detection. Cancer becomes far more likely. So the historical reality, sulfuric acid and radiation were always together in uranium work. In uranium operation, sulfuric acid was everywhere. There were heap leaching piles, in situ leaching wells, ore processing tanks, dust control sprays, emissions from on site acid plants. So the workers inhaled the acid mist, the vapor and dust at the same time as radon, uranium dust, radioactive ores, and those radons. This combination created the perfect condition for lungs to absorb and retain radiation. The cover story, blame what people can feel, hide what they can't. Sulfur gave companies a convenient, visible explanation. Well, your cough is from acid mist. Well, your eyes burn because of sulfur fumes. Yeah, everyone in sulfur plants cough. It's normal. Meanwhile, radiation had no smell, had no immediate sensation, and accumulated quietly inside those tissues. So sulfur became both the immediate irritant and the camouflage for deeper, invisible radiological harm. So sulfuric acid did not merely sit along radiation, it supercharged it by destroying the lung's natural barrier, by dissolving uranium dust and making it more mobile, by making radon daughters stickier and more deeply deposited, by creating chronic inflammation that amplifies mutation, that paralyzes the lung's clearance system, that's trapping radioactive particles inside scar tissue, that weakening local immune repair systems. Yeah, that's what's going on with me. The reason this thing is escalated is because really my body can't keep up. I mean, I think my body has done a marvel. I should have been dead years ago, but the open air, the windows, I've been on a single diet, only single source foods. And sleep. I've given my body time to sleep. In the last 5 years, I can only think of maybe a couple of times that I had trouble sleeping. That's why I'm saying get some sleep. Even if you have to do THC infused sleep, get some THC distillant. It takes care of the sickness. It takes care of this all the stuff it takes care of. The rate that companies are closing down in this country, I suggest you stock up on what you are going to need. My pets would not be alive if I was not treating them with this THC concentrate. They would be dead by now. I would be dead by now because you have to keep eating. It wipes out your appetite. What happens is your organs start to take away all of your nutrients to fight off the cancers and everything's going around this house. So we're very, very thin, but we've been keeping eating. That's the only way that we're still alive is that we eat and we sleep and we take THC distillants at night. So let's talk a little bit about more about why uranium was unique in the world. Um, because only uranium mining used sulfuric acid at that scale on a radioactive ore. So, to get uranium cheaply out of rock, the industry standardized sulfuric acid leaching, and that required huge sulfur stockpiles, sulfur burning plants, sulfuric acid tanks and pipes, acid spray systems, open vats and leach pads. No other mining industry uses sulfuric acid so constantly in such huge quantities and on a radioactive ore. So only uranium miners regular inhaled sulfur fumes, acid mist, and acid dust. So uranium mines generated two poisons at once. They produce dust and toxic metals, but not ionizing radiation. And they also deal with, let me see here. Uranium mining is the rare setting where sulfuric acid destroys lungs. Radon and radioactive dust exploit that damage. That double exposure was almost a perfect storm. I would say it's on purpose, but hey, everybody's got to decide for themselves. I have everything over on my website, everything you want to know. I have 100 times more information than I'm going to tell you today. I would hope that at least one of you will go over there and study this. You cannot explain this to anybody else if you don't understand it, and it will hit you like a rock from behind if you don't know it's coming. Be educated and be prepared. I'm not going to keep bothering you with this message, but please, it is not a happy place when you end up with your teeth. Your teeth are little things, and you got a huge open sore on your face. This isn't really a fun existence, right? So that double exposure created a perfect storm. Uranium is one of the only acid leaching minerals that is also a radiation source. Strong acid leaching is also used for copper, nickel, zinc, and some rare earths, but those ores are not significantly radioactive. Other radioactive materials are usually refined in closed, specialized nuclear facilities, handled by smaller, more controlled operations. Uranium mining is nearly alone in this combination. They have the radioactive ore they have extracted with strong acid in large, open industrial settings. Only uranium mines had acid mist and radiation in the same breathing zone. When they use this stuff in hospitals and other places, they're filtered, they're ventilated, they're sealed, and they're regulated. Uranium mines, by contrast, were dusty, poorly ventilated, full of radon gas, sprayed with sulfuric acid, used open vats and heaps of it. It was chaotic, mixing exposure elements unlike any other. In situ, leaching took the hazard underground and into the air. Uranium is one of the few materials where companies inject sulfuric acid directly into rock formations underground. This process releases acid vapors, radon gas, radioactive particles, and acidic groundwater aerosols. Workers stood above these wells or worked near them while vapor clouds rose among around them. No other mining method routinely creates combined acid plus radiation vapor plumes in the same work zone. So, uranium ore emits radon, and acid makes radon deadlier. Radon alone is dangerous, but radon in acid damaging lungs is much worse because in those uranium mines, the radon flowed out of exposed rock and fractures. Sulfuric acid fumes had already shredded the lung barrier. So the ordinary radon hazard was multiplied by the chemical damage from acid. That double hit did not exist in other industries. Yeah, it's kind of crazy, right? Why they do that just in uranium, I don't really know. No other mine forced workers to breathe chemical burns and radiation at the same time. Coal mines have coal dust, silica mines have silica, asbestos mines have fibers. But in uranium mines, they get chemical burns, lung irritation, and fibrosis. What happened in the same lungs, they were also receiving radon, uranium dust, and the daughters. This amplified damage. So, yeah, this uniqueness made uranium mining perfect for denial because sulfur explains immediate visible symptoms. If they say it's sulfur, they can explain the coughing, the eye burning, the breathing trouble, and the skin irritation. And companies could then say this is normal sulfur irritation. You see this in many chemical plants. At the same time, the deadly radiation effects were delayed and invisible. This made uranium mining uniquely suited for misdirection, blaming ordinary mine dust, suppressing radiation claims. So, yeah, everybody was pretty much set up. And then they came up with, well, nothing could be done. They called it natural to dodge responsibility. They said radon is natural. Acid fumes are part of the process. Dust is inevitably underground. Miners accept those risks. So they knew it. They weaponized mixed exposures because sulfur and radiation symptoms overlap. They could then say, well, we cannot know whether sulfur or radiation caused this illness. Well, mixed exposures cause causation unclear. Well, without clear proof, we cannot compensate. Two hazards, one body, one job site. And they use this overlap to deny both. So they ignored the fact that mining operations multiply radon release, that blasting opens new pathways, that poor ventilation traps gas, that radioactive dust in a man-made industrial is a man-made industrial byproduct. They pretended sulfuric acid was just ordinary chemical exposure. When miners reported burning lungs, choking air, and chemical stench, companies said, every mine has chemicals. This is normal for sulfur plants. But that was false. Only uranium mines use industrial scale sulfuric acid as the main extraction tool. Other mines might have chemicals, but not this mixture of acid plus radiation with almost no containment. They use scientific uncertainty as a way to hide it all. Well, the health effects of low level radiation are uncertain. More research is needed. And the same phrases I also found in all of this data, these lawsuits. And at the same time, internal data showed that miners were dying young. They were showing lung cancer clusters. They were showing abnormal radon readings, chromosomal damage to workers. It was the same playbook as tobacco, asbestos, and lead. Manufacture doubt, delay regulation. They blamed miners instead of the mines. Companies and agencies said, they smoked. They ignored safety rules. Those Navajo workers, they didn't really complain clearly. The high altitude might explain lung issues. Culture and diet could be factors. You don't know about these people. By scattering blame everywhere, they avoided confronting the obvious. The mine air was lethal. They claimed it was too complex to regulate. The official language was this quote, combined chemical and radiological exposure are too complex to set standards. Those were their exact words. At the same time, Europe uranium mines had radon standards. They had nuclear labs had standards. They had medical radiation workers had standards. Only uranium miners were told it was just too difficult. They openly acknowledged the acid radiation synergy, then ignored it in internal memos. In internal memos, they admitted that sulfuric acid makes radioactive inhalation more dangerous. But instead of acting, they essentially said, this is simply a consequence of uranium extraction. Essentially, they said, well, we know this is dangerous. We do not intend to change it. Natural radon as a final escape hatch. By repeating, radon comes naturally from rock. They tried to shift the entire problem onto acts of nature, non industrial negligence. They never admitted mining amplified radon release enormously. Ventilation could have cut risk drastically. Radioactive dust and acid mist were man made conditions. In reality, solutions were simple and available. They could have installed real ventilation, used wet drilling, enclosed acid leach systems, supplied respirators, monitored radon and personal dose honestly, posted warnings, educated workers, tracked health outcomes, but they chose not to. So nothing could be done was never a technical problem. It was a political and economic choice. And the Navajo miners were the most harmed and the least protected. You know, those Navajo people that got beaten for their lives out of their own land that got to live in those horrible reservations. Yeah, now they got uranium mines. They still have uranium mines, but I'm just too tired to go into what's going on right now. But yeah, those Navajos, you know, the people that helped bail them out in World War II. Yeah, those same people. They were chosen precisely because they were seen as isolated and unlikely to sue. These are their own words. I pulled these from their own lawsuits. I did not manufacture any of this. Internal assessments describe Navajo workers as far from lawyers, unfamiliar with legal rights, unlikely to sue the federal government, unlikely to fully understand technical warnings. In other words, they were the perfect workers for a dangerous, secretive industry. Warnings were never translated. The government and the AEC never translated radon and radiation warnings into Navajo languages. They never translated internal risk summaries. They never translated health bulletins. Not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to. They did not want fear, resistance, or interruption of production. Navajo mines had some of the highest radon levels in the world, but while other mines eventually added blowers and ducts and fresh air shafts, many Navajo mines had absolutely none. Radon levels in Navajo mines reached 20 to 600 times safe limits. They were well known and measured and documented. From their own words, they were matched and exceeded the most dangerous mines on Earth. They were not ignorant of any of this. They simply did not act. Navajo miners were last in line or never in line for protective gear. From the 1950s to 1970s, Navajo miners commonly had no respirators, no protective clothing, no badges, no dose meters, no training, no medical monitoring, no hazard pay. Meanwhile, white miners in some regions began receiving improvement decades earlier. In the case of the Navajo miners, their homes were also contaminated. Unlike many other workers, Navajo miners lived right next to those mines. They built their homes with tailings because it looked like clean sand. They had their children playing in waste piles. They had sheep and livestock drinking from contaminated water. They dried their laundry on radioactive fences. So their exposure was at work, at home, and around the clock. And the radiation data was collected and kept from them. The AEC and the Public Health Service, they logged those radon readings. They tracked early lung cancers. They marked concerning reports confidential. Even some operators never saw the worst data. Miners saw none of it. Uranium was critical for weapons. No, it was critical for right now. This is going to be our death weapon. National security overruled Navajo health. The Navajo Indians were blamed for their own deaths. When cancer surged, officials blamed smoking, genetic predisposition, cultural factors, their altitude, and their diet. But the catch was this: Many Navajo miners did not smoke at all. Their culture discouraged it. Yet lung cancer deaths were written off as a lifestyle. And the insult on top of the injury, when the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act finally passed in 1990, Navajo miners filed many claims. They also saw the highest denial rates because there were no job records, no medical records, no badges, no documented exposures, and misclassified causes of death. The system required proof that the system itself had systematically prevented them from ever collecting. They stayed in the mines because they trusted authority. Navajo miners often said these quotes: "We believed that government would not harm us. We thought we were serving our country. We thought the dust was just earth." That trust was taken and weaponized against them. They were unique in that they faced at work the radon, the sulfuric acid, the radioactive dust. At home, they had contaminated water, radioactive building materials, tailings in the yard, dust storms moving waste through villages. No other uranium forest in America lived in 24/7 exposure zones the way the native Navajo did. The silence was enforced by distance and poverty. Navajo miners often had no transportation, no lawyers, limited English, minimal political representation, mistrust of outside institutions. This made it nearly impossible to challenge what was being done to them. They had the highest exposures, the lowest protections. They had no warnings, no translations, no monitoring, no medical follow up, no documentation, no legal access, no political voice, no compensation for decades. This is why they became the most harmed and least protected population in this whole uranium story. So, what skyrocketed? Cancer and illness. Navajo miners had lung cancer rates up to 14 times higher than white miners and roughly 100 times the national rate for non smoking men. They had kidney cancer, uranium in both. They had it in their kidneys. They had a radioactive heavy metal. They had acid damaged lungs that allowed more uranium into their blood, filtered by kidneys, damaged by kidney cells, causing mutations. Kidney cancer rates rose 3 to 5 times among exposed workers. Bone cancer, radioactive dust, and elements in bone marrow cause osteochondromas, marrow failure, chronic pain, leukemia like conditions. Uranium and radium accumulation where newborn is formed. You get leukemias high among underground miners, mill workers, children near the tailings. The radon daughters and other radiosexides enter the bloodstream, irradiate the bone marrow, breast cancer in women. Even if women did not work in the mines, they washed contaminated clothes. They lived near the tailings. They drank polluted water. They cooked and slept in contaminated homes. Breast cancer increased sharply in communities closest to waste sites. Digestive cancers from drinking uranium contaminated water. Stomach cancer, esophageal cancer, colon cancer. Rates were highest nearing mine draining sources. Liver cancer. The liver, a filter for blood toxins, accumulated the radioisotops leading to liver tumors, cirrhosis unrelated to alcohol use. Thyroid cancer from inhaled radioactive dust, contaminated meat and milk from livestock, concentrating. Thyroid nodules and cancers rose significantly. Childhood cancers, children near mines had more bone cancers, leukemias, brain tumors, liver, lymphomas. Many had played in tailing piles like sand dunes and were never warned. Non cancer illnesses were just as devastating. Severe lung disease, even before cancer, for fibrosis, emphysema in non smokers, chronic bronchitis, silicosis plus radiation damage, massive lung scarring. Many died from respiratory failure in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then, of course, kidney failure, autoimmune. Yeah, they really got hit. Birth defects suppressed for years, but included cleft palate, limb defects, heart defects, neural tube defects, growth restrictions, just like those poor babies from Iraq. The babies from Iraq got hit in one huge big dose. Women were told that it was genetic, ignoring environmental causes. Neurological problems from uranium, arsenic, and other contaminants. People had numbness, nerve pain, coordination problems, memory issues, thyroid disorders, reproductive harm. The men had reduced fertility. And the cruelest part, many Navajo miners never lived long enough to develop cancer. They first died from their lungs collapsing, kidney failure, fibrosis, chronic infections, and heart failure due to damaged lungs. These were almost never counted as radiation deaths, though they very clearly belonged to the same exposure story. I'm going to be covering a tiny bit about this alchemy they're talking about. I believe it is total BS. Alchemy was the earliest ancient version of chemistry mixed with philosophy and spiritual ideas. It was part science, part spirituality, part metaphor, part guesswork, part symbolic. Alchemy existed before modern chemistry. People didn't know about atoms or molecules, so they used symbols, metaphors, trial and error. They attempted things like turning base gold into into base metals into gold, creating purity in matter. So the first thing they did was alchemy. And there are actually people now saying that, well, alchemy was great. Well, I think those people should just move to Sedona. I spent a few years in Sedona. Those people are all about alchemy, magic tricks, and all this BS. So let's talk about how did quantum physics intersect with alchemy. Well, not scientifically, but culturally, people tried to connect them. Some quantum pioneers were personally interested in symbolism. A few early physicists were, and let me see, some had side interests in psychology and symbolism. Some work with Jung about archetypes and all that. This was personal curiosity, not scientific research. And this whole quantum theory business that got brewed up by these people, I don't believe a minute of this quantum theory stuff, but I'll tell you what they say it is. Quantum theory felt mystical to many people. And remember, quantum theory came out of the exact same group of people as all of this got started. The people that started quantum theory and all of this are the exact same people from Central Europe that started all the science stuff in the US. They're the ones that cooked up quantum theory. People who don't understand the math began saying, well, quantum physics proves ancient mystics were right. But these writers are saying that stuff. Like the guy that I talked about in the very beginning that was talking about sulfur and uranium look the same. Well, they do look the same, but then he spun off into all this other BS, right? So it's kind of like it's really I see quantum and alchemy as total misdirections. It just I don't know. I'm not going to spend much time on it. I find it really pretty boring to even talk about it, but um because that one guy was talking they really start to move symbols around. So sulfur is a symbol in alchemy. In alchemy, sulfur is fire, desire, destruction, transformation. Yeah, I really think there is something to these symbolic meanings, but for today, I'm not going to get all boggled down to it because what they do is they'll start talking about quantum and then they'll slide into a little bit of this. And before you know it, you're thinking, well, what were we talking about? So I have more on my website. I'm a little bit, like I said, I don't believe that it was true. Quantum theory was birthed almost entirely in German speaking Europe between the 1900s and the 1935s. It came out of University of Berlin. It came out of Vienna. It came out of Denmark. So, yeah, it came out of all those same people. And like I said, for my purpose today, it's really not at the top of my list. So let's get back to this sulfur stuff. I might have more about it here. I don't really know. But anyway, so So, what sulfur exposure does to a person? Okay, so we have sulfur dioxide, which is SO2, and that comes from coal plants. That can cause burning throats, coughing, wheezing, tight chest, asthma flare, irritated eyes, and headaches. Then you have hydrogen sulfide, or H2S. That has a rotten egg smell, but that also causes headaches, nausea, confusion, severe airway irritation. And then you have the elemental sulfur, which is the yellow powder, and that causes skin irritation, dryness, mild respiratory irritation. So then the sulfate particles are fine pollution from coal, and they cause all the same things: inflammation, headaches, fatigue, cardiovascular, and delayed healing. And then that sulfuric acid mist, this is the worst one that causes a burning of the lungs, persistent cough, chest pain. I think they're using some sort of sulfuric mist in this whole electrical system they've got going on, because there's a lot of confusion over mustard gas. Mustard gas contains sulfur. And I've already talked about mustard gas and stuff in the past, um, but sulfur in the air pollution cannot become mustard gas. They're different chemicals. So, and coal plants release massive sulfur. Um, Coal naturally contains sulfur, and they release a lot in coal plants. And here's where I think it's landing. Somehow they're mixing this sulfur with this nuclear, and they're creating this dirty electricity. I have more questions than I have answers today. Remember, the dirty electricity is the electrical noise and voltage spikes on wiring caused by devices converting AC to DC or chopping power. And it's a type of electrical distortion. So you're going to also increase your dirty electricity if you use things like dimmer switches, LED lighting, solar inverters, switching power supplies, computers. So yeah, they know where the dirty electricity is coming, what it's affecting, but no one is really saying what exactly is it, right? Um, because they're saying that there's no strong evidence that dirty electricity breaks the cells, causes cancer, or acts like a weapon. But the research is incomplete. There are correlations with headaches, sleep issues, and fatigue. Engineering standards are not strict. So, yeah, they haven't done any studies. The field is understudied, poorly regulated, not understood well enough to dismiss, but also not proven harmful to the extreme. So, yeah, so dirty electricity does exist, but it's not chemically related to sulfur. So, I'm very, very fuzzy. Because they started using sulfur based chemical weapons early on because sulfur was cheap and abundant. The industrial sulfur chemistry was well understood. They knew that sulfur compounds cling to skin and clothing. Sulfur stores well and remains stable. They created persistent agents that contaminate battlefields. Early gas masks could not block the skin absorption. And Germany already led sulfur based chemical industry. So sulfur mustards became the first mass produced chemical weapons. And this is why they're always using something they've been using for a very long time, like that thermite developed in the 1800s. If it's cheap, if it's mass produced, and it's going to kill a lot of us, they're going to use it. So, but mustard gas, when they tested it out in early World War I did a show about it, but just from memory, they had problems because it blew back on the attackers when they tried to blow it out in the air. It stayed on the ground, slowed them down. And also, let me see, there was something else about mustard gas. So anyway, so because they couldn't contain the gas because it just shoot out into the air, that's why it no longer was being used. Um, so yeah, I don't really know. So, just in summary, alchemy is usually early chemistry mixed with spiritual symbolism. Sounds very heebie jeebie. Oh, we can't tell you now. And quantum physics is modern mathematical science born in German speaking universities. And the connection between the two is only symbolic or psychological, not scientific. So, yeah, because it started out early with this mustard gas and stuff, because sulfur is a common yellow mineral. It smells like rotten eggs when burnt. Only that one kind does, though. Sulfur is used for gunpowder, fertilizer, matches, and industrial chemicals. Non radioactive, cheap, and abundant, found everywhere in nature. Uranium, a heavy silvery metal, radioactive, used for nuclear reactors and atom bombs, rare and strategically available, tightly regulated, and often mined in secrecy in the early 1900s. So these two chemicals are not interchangeable. So how they're working together, I don't really know for sure, because from the 1920s to the 1940s, governments hid uranium mining and research by labeling it as phosphate extraction, sulfur operations, rare earths, heavy metals, or industrial chemical processing. And this was done to avoid foreign spies, avoid public panic, disguise military intentions, protect uranium supply chains, and avoid listing true operations on public documents. Because sulfur was common and unremarkable, it was a perfect cover label. For example, in the Congo's uranium separation facilities, they were described as chemical extraction. Germany German uranium work was hidden under metallurgical research. In the Manhattan Project, procurement passed through normal chemical suppliers. So, but sulfur paperwork and sulfur industry labels were used to as camouflage for uranium activities. So they did they did camouflage it on purpose, right? Um, so because they camouflaged it on purpose, you have to really wonder why, right? Let me scroll down here. Let me put the hold for a second here. Yeah, I don't really know. We get back into this quantum business. Quantum theory became perfect for military and intelligence secrecy. Almost nobody can verify quantum math. Quantum deals with unseeable things. This makes secrecy easy. They say things like, well, you can't see it, it's quantum. The Cold War made secrecy normal. Physics became classified. Strange explanations became commonplace. Complexity shuts down questions. Quantum becomes a cover for real classified programs. If something failed, quantum effects interfered. If it worked, it was reclassified. Yeah, I see quantum as a just a big trick. Um, Quantum results were independently reproduced worldwide. Many founders openly agree. Blah blah blah. Okay, so the founders came out of Germany, Einstein, and that whole group, Heisenberg, all that group. And here's where nobody's talking about it. Okay, there was a group in Germany. Okay, that whole group of people essentially came over to the United States. And I have a whole bunch more about them that I'll be getting to later. I did this massive timeline dive into all that, but not for right this second. So essentially, what happened was this: there was a whole group of people over in Germany, these scientists and stuff, right? Einstein, that little group. Well, Einstein then wrote that letter to FDR saying, hey, you got to watch out for this radiation stuff. So then the U.S. got interested in uranium, right? So then what they do? Well, they brought over all of those all those different scientists came over to the United States. And not only one of them was born in the United States, and that person was Oppenheimer. But Oppenheimer's family was very wealthy, and they came from a place called Prussia. Prussia was before Germany. And I would spin off the top of my head if I can't explain it all right now. I'll get back with the whole Prussia business. But a lot of these people came out of Prussia and Germany, and they were all Ashkenazi Jews. No doubt about that, okay? all of them were Ashkenazi. And then there was another group that nobody really connects. There was a group over in Hungary, and they were called the Budapest phenomena. So there were two groups, okay? We got the group in Germany and we got the Hungary group. Well, the Hungary group, um, they were over there. There was a group of them, and they came after the first German group. But they also expanded on this quantum thing. The Hungary group did. They were called the Budapest phenomenon. And supposedly, this is how it worked. Over there in Hungary, they developed all of these people they called geniuses, okay? And here again, they have these coffee houses, right? So in Hungary, they had German or Yiddish, and they had these students, they were debating math and stuff. So a lot of people were living over in Hungary, a lot of gypsies, right? So there was a Hungary group. They thought, oh, they're so smart, they're so smart. Well, the Hungary group then moved into, when Hungary got taken over, they moved to Germany. I hope I'm not confusing. The Hungary group, then when Hungary got taken over, they went to Germany, and then Germany expelled them to the United States. So essentially, they got the German group and the Hungarian group. All these scientists all came to the United States, and they all worked on everything from the nuclear thing to the Nassau thing, the uh, space deal. But I believe they all were working on nuclear because we never really went to space, right? So over in Hungary, people like Newman, Wigner, Teller, and Cesar, they were there learning, okay? And they claim that uh, Germany absorbed them. They arrived in Germany exactly when quantum physics was exploding. But then Hitler came along, and they said, well, Hitler got rid of all of them. So the US then got them all. So essentially, basically, they cooked it up so that all of the brain drain for all this stuff came either out of Germany or out of Hungary. Let's just keep that part straight, okay? So Germany and Austria invented quantum mechanics and the nuclear theory, okay? Then the Hungarian Jewish mathematicians perfected it and turned it into workable nuclear technology. And then the United States provided the land, the money, and the industrial capacity. So the Manhattan Project was essentially a European intellectual creation that got executed here on United States soil. So, but I looked through to find out what historians have ever talked about, and no one has really talked much about this at all. How history works is this: if you're a historian and you want to write about these geniuses or idiots over there in Hungary, however you want to look at it, they're over in they're Hungary. They got all these smart Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish kids. They're studying away. They're studying math and all this stuff. They create all these geniuses. All those geniuses go over to Germany to expand that. And so then they all come here to the United States. And yeah, it's crazy that they all ended up coming here, right? And the only person in the entire group, Oppenheimer, was born here. But he also comes from a long line of Ashkenazi Jewish people who came out of that Prussia region. Too complicated to get into right this second. But yeah, so hold on a second here. So yeah, I traced every single one of these people, and that was exactly it. So yeah, I can say this with complete confidence, the entire business of nuclear and all of this stuff that the US became leaders at, all of it, every bit of it, came either out of Germany or out of Hungary. Because Hungary was called the Ashkenazi East of Central Europe. So, and what happens is Jewish historians do not split Europe the same way political maps do. Their boundaries reflect migration patterns, communities, languages. So, um, what they considered Western Ashkenazi Jew area was Germany, France, and the Netherlands. What they were considered Eastern Ashkenazi was Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And Hungary sits right there in the middle. It absorbed influences from both sides. So they were considered Eastern Ashkenazi because of ancestry, cultural roots, and synagogue traditions. Because you can't just trace these people to being Jews, you got to trace them to what kind of Jews were they, right? So, okay, so what happened was they also absorbed Central European intellectual culture because Hungary was embedded inside the Austro Hungarian Empire for centuries. So Hungarian Jews were geographically Eastern European, but culturally they were considered Central European. Ethnically, they were considered Eastern Ashkenazi. Linguistically, they were unique. They spoke Hungarian plus German Yiddish. They were educated Germanic in elite math and science, and that is a rare combination. So Hungary's position between worlds created a perfect storm. Eastern European Jewish survival pressure, Central European German style mathematics training, bilingual or trilingual language environments, Austro Hungarian elite culture, political collapse and instability, anti Jewish laws that forced immigration. This mix did not exist anywhere else. This is the root of the so called Budapest phenomena. Hungary was not just Eastern Europe, it was an Eastern Europe society run by Germanic imperial bureaucracy with a Jewish middle class that was highly educated, multilingual, and elite. This structure produced the scientific cluster that later shaped nuclear physics. And the Hungarian scientists of the Manhattan Project, they were called the Martians. These are the true Budapest born core. John von Neumann, he was born in Budapest. Edward Teller, also born in Budapest. Eugene Wagner, also born Budapest. It's hard to pronounce it weird. Leo Schliessler, born in Budapest. These four formed the heart of the Hungarian presence inside of the Manhattan Project. All four of them were born within miles of each other. They were all Ashkenazi Jews. They were all from Budapest's elite intellectual class. They all shaped by Hungary's extreme mathematician schooling. They were pushed out by anti Jewish laws in the 1920s. They were pushed out again by Hitler in the 1930s. They were absorbed into Princeton, Chicago, Columbia, and Los Alamos. No other city in the entire world produced such a concentrated cluster of nuclear era genius, or I would say a nuclear era trick, right? Hey, they all lived around each other. They all worked around. They say, oh, they all fought amongst each other. Yeah, well, all psychopaths argue amongst each other. They're hateful people. What do you expect? But they all lived around each other. You can't tell me this didn't get kind of like cooked up. I mean, it sounds very cooked up to me. So only four of them are the true Hungarian Martians, they're called. These are the men historians mean when they call the Hungarians at Los Alamos. They alone, as a group, had more impact on nuclear science than entire nations. So how'd they get this group of people? Well, in 1867, Jews in Hungary were emancipated earlier than in most Eastern European regions. One generation later, Jewish families had risen into engineering, law, medicine, finance, civil service. This produced a powerful, educated bourgeoisie. Extreme math education. Budapest's elite schools taught set theory, combinatorics, non Euclidean geometry, formal logic, probability, proofs, often taught by working mathematicians, not regular teachers. Students said these schools were harder than university level classes in America. The language effect, it was Hungarian plus German and Yiddish. That helped them improve pattern recognition, symbolic reasoning, abstract thinking, and tons of lies. No, I just made that last part up. So they consider coffee houses. Where did we consider coffee houses? Coffee houses in the UK were also popular. Remember after they burned down London? Oh, we all met in coffee houses. Well, so did the Budapest people. Kind of like Silicon Valley all starts in garages, right? These people all hang around coffee houses. Coffee houses, intellectual culture. Teenagers read journals, played chess, discussed philosophy, debated mathematics. Sound like a bunch of boring kids. Families understood your mind is the only thing they cannot take. This produced intense drive. Well, this is according to them, right? Hungary collapsed twice. In 1918, the empire dissolved. In 1920, they had numerous anti Jewish laws. Oh boy. 1930, rise of fascism. Oh boy, here we go again. Jobs vanished. Universities purged. Geniuses had to. Geniuses had nowhere to stay, so they fled. First to Berlin, then to America. Gee, it's just amazing, isn't it? Just amazing how this all worked out. They were classmates or competitors. Talent pushed talent. How this fed into nuclear physics. Germany created quantum mechanics, which I consider a complete pile of BS, but Hungary provided the mathematicians who weaponized it. America provided the industrial infrastructure. So German physics created the theory, Hungarian physics created the weapon, and America built the factory and ran the whole thing, right? Funny how that worked out. So, sulfur versus uranium. Sulfur is a common yellow mineral. Uranium, heavy metal and radioactive. So, governments used sulfur, phosphate, or chemical extraction labels to hide uranium mining. This has happened in the Congo, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and early in the US. So sulfur was always a cover story, not a substitute. So yeah, and this all happened. Remember back in the 1600s, the rise of those experts and stuff, right? Um, Quantum theory as real science and as a tool of secrecy. Quantum mechanics is mathematically difficult, invisible to everyday experience, kind of like radium, right? You can't see the stuff in the air, but it's going to take it in. Expensive to test, hard to independently verify, which made it perfect for Cold War propaganda, intelligence cover stories, classified research, public mystification. Its weirdness became part of state power. So, yeah, basically, let's go through this little timeline here of the two-step pipeline that built nuclear science. Germany and Austria, 1900s to 1930s, invented quantum mechanics, built the theoretical framework, discovered the nuclear fission. Hungary, 1918 to 1940, provided the mathematicians and engineers, developed chain reaction theory, developed reactor physics, built computing frameworks, shaped bomb design and strategy. Together, these waves form the backbone of modern physics. So Hungary is Eastern European geographically, Central Europe culturally, and all of them just happen to be Ashkenazi Jews. The collapse pushed Hungary's best students to Berlin. Gee, isn't that interesting how that happened, right? The young scientists moved to Berlin, Göttingen, Leipzig, and Munich. At the same time, Germany already had Einstein, Max Born, Heisenberg, Pauli, and Hilbert. Gee, isn't that convenient? Very, very convenient. Hungarian students jumped into the most advanced physics culture on Earth right when quantum mechanics was exploding. So, the accidental migration, I don't think this is accidental for 1 second, right? It was Budapest, Berlin to Princeton and Chicago. This created a second logistical migration. Yeah, Germany to the U.S., to Princeton, Columbia, Chicago, and Berkeley. The U.S. suddenly, just suddenly, out of thin air, they got their hands on the best mathematicians of Hungary. They got the best theoretical physicists of Germany and Austria. The refugees who understood fission first, Seisger and Weiger. Now, isn't that just fascinating that the U.S. just got all of this stuff just because of little old Hitler, right? So they were all tied together. They all worked together. Like Teller was displaced by collapse, influenced early hydrogen bomb ideas. He was shaped by displacement from Hungary, displacement from Germany, fear of fascism, deep sense of vulnerability. He pushed the U.S. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cough in the microphone. He pushed the U.S. to pursue the hydrogen bomb and preventative nuclear dominance. His worldview was a product of collapsed trauma, not pure scientific curiosity. Yeah, and Wigner, the quiet architect of U.S. nuclear engineering. Wigner designed the first nuclear reactors, calculated neutron behavior, made fission feasible on an industrial scale. He left Hungary because of collapse. Oh, he had to go, he had to go, he had to go. If Wigner stayed in Europe, the USA does not get industrial capacity to build the bomb. Go, Wigner. Glad you got to the United States. And then, of course, we have John von Neumann, the mathematical brain that made modern nuclear weapons possible. Von Neumann was forced to lead Hungary because of the collapse. Ultra nationalism, and they were against the Jews again. Damn it, they wanted those Jews out of there. Well, so he later invented modern game theory, developed shockwave calculations, contributed to explosive lensing, designed early computing systems that ran Los Alamos simulations, helped guide nuclear targeting strategies, and all because he was forced out of Hungary, damn it. His brilliance was unleashed only because America became the refuge for a collapse era. You know, like, oh, I'm so glad America was there for them. I can't even take it right now. I can't take it. I'm so happy. Oh my God, what a friggin' setup. So, why Hungary's collapse shaped nuclear physics? Because collapse produced intellectual survivalism. Brains came in the only form of security. Anti-Jewish laws expelled the brightest students. They just had to leave. Germany absorbed them just as quantum mechanics was born. Isn't that perfect timing? Hitler then expelled them. They fled to America, taking the world's strongest mathematical and physics minds with them. I'm glad they got out away from that Hitler. They carried urgency, fear, and ambition shaped by instability. They produced revolutionary thinking about chain reactions, weapons, and energy. These displaced Hungarian Jews form the core of U.S. nuclear theory. Without Hungary's collapse, the Manhattan Project's theoretical spine would not exist. Did you read that part? Without Hungary's collapse, the Manhattan Project theoretical spine would not exist. Gee, what a shame that would have been, right? If only we could have turned back, what was I saying? Turn back the clock of time. So, in Jewish history, Hungary is considered Ashkenazi East Central Europe. Jewish historians divide regions slightly differently. Western Ashkenazi, Eastern Ashkenazi, yeah, they're all there, all of them, right? And they all just happen to get together and they all just happen to come to the United States. Isn't that just fascinating news, right? So, and of course, we had the Hungarian scientists. They were called the Martians and the Budapest phenomena, and they all came from rich Jewish families and Ashkenazi to be more specific. But then there was a second tier of peripheral Hungarian or Hungary linked figures. Um, these individuals were not the primary Budapest core. Yeah, okay, I got a list of them down below. But the bottom line is this. Well, without all of these people, no one would have any of this nuclear stuff here in the United States because none of these people, except for Oppenheimer, were actually even born in this country, okay? And if you want to look at my website, if you want to figure out if you're in one of these regions, all you have to do is hit Control F or Control Find and plug in your country, because I have slice and dices things into a million pieces. I have information about what countries have nuclear stored but no nuclear reactors. How many nuclear reactors does every country have? How many, blah, blah, blah. I have everything slice and dice that you ever want to find out about, because I believe they never made plans to store nuclear stuff, because why would they store it, right? This whole thing is to just have it blow up one day and kill us all, right? Boom, here we go. Because they say certain things. They say things like, well, only scientists can tell if this is really a nuclear blast. Well, how do scientists know what a nuclear blast looks like? Well, because they look at the pictures, right? Well, where'd they get those pictures from? Well, those pictures were manipulated out at Lookout Mountain in California. So while they were doing the testing over in Nevada and blowing up people over there's lives, the downwinders and stuff, they were doing pictures. And that's where that mushroom cloud came out of. That mushroom cloud is not a real mushroom cloud. That mushroom cloud came out of the laboratories at Lookout Mountain. So then they say, well, yeah, but only experts can tell if it's a mushroom cloud. So then I start asking, well, how do experts know if it's a mushroom cloud? Well, because they have those pictures. So then you go in a circle, right? Because those pictures are fake. So the whole mushroom cloud thing was fake. And so they've been storing stuff all around this country all around the world actually, for a very long time, because the vast majority of U.S. nuclear waste is actually stored at the nuclear power plants. Because Yucca Mountain never opened, the United States stores most spent nuclear fuel exactly where it was created, at commercial reactor sites. There are more than 70 nuclear power plants across 33 states that still hold their own waste, and they store it in spent fuel pools. These are large, deep water pools that cool used fuel rods after they are removed from the reactor. Many pools are overcrowded, and decades past their originally intended design life. Pools were never meant to be long storage solutions, and they're also held in what's called dry cask storage. After fuel cools in the pools for several years, it can be transferred into huge steel and concrete cylinders called dry casks, CASKS. These sit outdoors on reinforced pads. Dry casks are safer than pools, but still considered temporary measures, not final disposal. So, more than 80,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel are currently stored right now at reactor sites. This is the largest single category of nuclear waste in the United States, and we have them all over the place. Palo Verde in Arizona, Diablo Canyon in California, Indian Point, New York, 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, Turkey Point, Florida, and dozens of reactors throughout the Midwest and East Coast. These locations hold their own waste on site because there is still no permanent national repository. The result is a patchwork system of scattered interim storage that has stretched on for decades. Hanford is the most contaminated nuclear site in America. It produced nearly all of the plutonium for U.S. nuclear weapons, including the Trinity device and the Fat Man bomb. So, yeah, Hanford has 56 million gallons of stored stuff. Yeah, there's a lot stored around this country. South Carolina's got a bunch of it. Um, so I have it all over my website. I'm not going to read every single one of them, but if you this is going to be kind of a case of, if you're more interested, you will certainly do your own research, and I certainly have provided you with all the tools to get started with. So I'm going to put this on hold for a second, see what I need to pick up more on. Okay, I got to wrap this show up. I'm going to do a quick tour through my website. I open up my website with the actual letter that Einstein wrote to FDR, "We got to get busy with this nuclear stuff. Europe is going to be catching up. We got to get busy." So yeah, that was a letter, and then I have all of the information. Historians have not been covering this. I couldn't find anybody that's talking about the German and the Hungarians together. Pieces of the story exist, but they're scattered across different fields and never woven together. Historians do acknowledge the Exodus, but only as a side effect of anti Jewish laws. They describe the firing of Jewish professors, banning of Jewish students, the collapse of German physics, the rise of Jewish physics versus German physics, and the migration of scientists to the USA. But they treat it as background, not the core framework shaping America's science. Almost no historian has connected the German and Hungarian migrations together. They treat Hungary as an anomaly, not as part of the same forced migration produced by Germany and Central European collapse. In reality, Hungarian and German exodus was caused by the same political pressures, targeting the same educated classes, producing the same scientific pipeline to America. Academia does not integrate these stories, but the evidence clearly does. Almost no historian explicitly states the larger truth that American nuclear science was built because Hitler destroyed European science. The U.S. scientific empire was an unintended byproduct of national Nazi policy. This interpretation is accurate, but historians tend to avoid it because it reframes the Manhattan Project, American scientific exceptionalism, nuclear mythology, European decline, and Cold War narratives. It also complicates the national myths about American genius. And then we had the second pipeline. The ex Nazis were absorbed into U.S. aerospace, is covered, but rarely alongside the refugee pipeline. These writers do not place paperclip next to the Jewish refugee story, even though the two pipelines shape the same Cold War system. Academia keeps the story separated. The refugee scientists on the Manhattan Project, the Nazi scientists on NASA and rockets and missiles. Why do they avoid it? Well, the U.S. likes to teach that it built its scientific power through innovation, genius, hard work, and frontier mentality. It is uncomfortable to admit that America became a scientific superpower by absorbing shattered European elites. It exposes contradictions in Cold War morality. America mistrusted Jewish refugee scientists. America protected Nazi scientists. America supposedly destroyed Oppenheimer. America promoted von Braun. This is politically awkward for history. It shows the U.S. did not rise alone. It was lifted by Europe's collapse. No mainstream historian has ever fully told the combined story of the German expulsion of Ashkenazi intellectuals, the Hungarian migration, the refugee pipeline into nuclear theory, the Nazi pipeline into aerospace and intelligence, and how these two hostile groups built American power. And also, they made Oppenheimer out to be a victim. I don't know. I'm not going to get all into it, but I don't see Oppenheimer as a victim. I see him as a real psycho lunatic, right? So they claim he was targeted and smeared, but he still went to work for the same elite groups. He was working with his old friend Einstein. He got jobs at universities. He didn't miss a paycheck. Oppenheimer likely was maybe just a player. We don't know that he was even that involved. He could have been the guy they were just taking pictures of, right? The real brains behind this was likely the U.S. military, not these actual individual scientists, right? America did not trust the same group of scientists who built its nuclear theory, but it actively embraced the engineers who had served the Third Reich. So, yeah, Excuse me. So yeah, the United States had a lot of reasons to cover this up, right? Um, because refugees and the Nazis rewired U.S. power. Simple as that. They got those white people to come over here and take care of this stuff. So yeah, this was not. So when they talk about American exceptionalism, well, American, German, and Hungary exceptionalism, right? That's where it all boils down to. Why do you think they still run around giving those Nazi salutes? Because they came out of that same region. And I'll be back with more of that timeline business because they actually started with Prussia. Prussia no longer exists, but that was really Germany, blah blah blah. It gets kind of it's too confusing for me to go over today. But I can guarantee you when I lay out the timeline, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So yeah, so America brought over those two groups. We call the German and Hungary into one group, and we got the actual Nazi, not NASA guys on the other group. And then, of course, they throw in that quantum business, right? So I got all the reactors listed over here. Who has how many? Why they have them? Who's storing them? Who has reactors? Just do control find. You can look for your own country. I think we need to be responsible. Nuclear power plants are nothing to joke around about. They're nothing that somebody should say, yeah, nobody ever got injured. That is absolutely not true. Now, how exactly they're pulling off the injuries, and they're doing something in those power plants to combine this stuff to create the dirty electricity that's getting pumped into our homes. Because I'm 100% the sore on my face, and this other issue is 100%. It's a kind of sore and stuff that you get from sulfur, not from nuclear. Did the comparison of all of this stuff. I'm not just guessing here. So some of my injuries are obviously coming from sulfur. Obviously, the other things are coming from the uranium. How are they misting this stuff and doing this stuff like they did to those poor mine people? I don't really know. Somehow there is a huge trick in here. They're mixing up this brew over in their labs and then they're spewing it out directly into our homes. So I think anybody who has electronics is vulnerable with dirty electricity, but likely only some countries may be getting hit with the full amount. Just my guess because nobody really knows, right? So, anyhow, so that's what I have over on my website. And let me get back over here. So, I don't know what to tell you. This is a story as I know it now. How exactly they're mixing it, can't really tell you. But I can tell you it's what they're doing because I've got the evidence. I've got the evidence on my face. I've got the evidence from all these Navajo lawsuits. Because on one side, you have sulfur from power plants, heavy, dirty, and physical. On the other side, you have the new quantum science coming out of Germany, invisible, theoretical, almost impossible to explain. Together, these two forces built the modern world, the electricity we use, the pollution we live with, and the nuclear power and weapons that shaped the last century. And none of this was by accident. We're still living with the results today. This is what happens when dirty fuels and big ideas grow up together. We're right now, my opinion, in the middle of a silent war. You can't see this stuff coming into your home. You can't hear it. You can't feel it. You can't smell it, but it's there. And you have to explain to me, how is this happening? Somehow they're mixing that sulfur with the uranium. I'm 100% on all that. None of this stuff is fake. The stories you're being told may be fake, but none of this is fake. And why doesn't history connect these things? Why has no historian ever connected these things? Well, because this is about a game of omission. Leave a lot of things out, make it sound so colluded and so confusing that nobody will bother to look. Actually, this is not that complicated. The next story I'm going to tell is about Iran and what they're going through right now with water. It's a story for the rest of us to also understand. None of this is by accident. This is about eugenics. They want to get rid of our DNA, and what better way to do that than environmental pollution like plutonium and sulfur? So be safe out there and goodbye for